Palm Sunday, special day. Church is, in its history, has looked back and taken note of particular things in the life of the church and the life of Christ and our lives with Christ. And this day of the triumphal entry, prophecy fulfilled, people shouting, "Oh, we're so glad. We're so glad it's finally here." And here we are at the beginning of a week when it would all come together. It will end on, what a funny juxtaposition of words, on Good Friday and the suffering that's there. And Easter's coming. Next Sunday's a high day, but we shouldn't run ahead. We shouldn't run ahead and miss what God would speak to us in the days coming. We will start then. I've got the narrated Bible out again this morning, and I want to read you about this day here that we celebrate. And then we're going to jump ahead a little bit. To the what happens on Friday, but at the beginning, I want us to make sure we understand what this day is and we get the feel for this day. It is quite different from how the end of a week. It is indeed a day of high praise. So this is going to be in chronological order if you're trying to follow along. I'm going to be in John and Matthew and Mark and Luke here in about every sentence I read. So you may just have to listen to this. And it starts the day Jesus enters Jerusalem after being at Bethany. He says, "The next day, the great crowd that had come for the feast heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. And they took up palm branches and they went out to meet him, shouting, 'Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel.' And it says, as Jesus approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, that he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied up, which no one has ever ridden," which is a miracle in itself that he rode it. "Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you what you're doing, tell him the Lord has need of it." And this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. It's from Zechariah. "Say to the daughters of Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, on the foal of a donkey." And at first it says that the disciples did not understand all of this, all of that, and much other things. But only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him and that they had done these things to him and for him. And they went and found the colt standing there, and they were untying it, and someone says, "What are you doing?" And of course they said, "The Master, the Lord has need of it." And that must have been good enough for the owner of that foal. And he said, "Well, go ahead and take it." And I assume they returned it a little bit later. And so he's riding on that colt. They threw their coats over it. And it says when they came near the place where the road goes down from the Mount of Olives, you see the Mount of Olives is to the south, or is to the east of Jerusalem, and it goes down a hill in the Kidron Valley, and the Kidron River's down at the base of it, and then it starts going up another hill where Jerusalem, and it comes right up to the wall. And so they're going down and they're able to look over and see that wonderful city. It's where it's happening. And when they came near the place where the road begins to go down from the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began to joyfully praise God. And in loud voices, they rose again. They praised him for all of the miracles that they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." That sounds like something the shepherds heard as well. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke these disciples." Why? Because they're given Christ worship, and you're not supposed to worship anyone but God. And Jesus replied to those learned Pharisees, says, "I tell you, if they would keep quiet, the very stones would cry out." And many people, it says, spread their cloaks on the road, while the others spread branches that they had cut from the field, the palm branches. And there at that place, I don't think far beyond, it says, as he approached Jerusalem and he saw the city, he wept over it and he said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, the peace that was coming to you. But he says, but now it is hidden from your eyes. I wonder how many times that we just didn't recognize that God had shown up, that the peace that we sought, that the miracle we needed, that the grace that would get us through was right there, right then. We just didn't see it sometimes. And he's talking he's praying in his heart, and he'll voice these concerns later on. He says, the day will come, weeping over Jerusalem, when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. And they will dash you to the ground, Jerusalem, you and your children within your walls, and they will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Things could have changed there, evidently, if they would have seen. It says, as Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was astir. The whole city, the Jews, the Romans, the Pilate had come down special for this season because wherever there's a lot of people, there's cause for trouble to start. And wherever you've got particularly intense spiritual things or intense even just religious things going on and people are impassioned about those, trouble could start from those things. So even Pilate was here. The whole city was abuzz. And the crowds were answering. Those who were in the city came out and they asked the crowd as they entered Jerusalem. It says, who is this? And the crowds answered, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. And now the crowd that was with him when he had called Lazarus, this was the crowd that was with him when he had called Lazarus from the tomb just a few days before and raised him from the dead. That word continued to spread. And many people, because that they had heard what he had, that he had given this miraculous sign just to Lazarus, went out to meet him. And so the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. Look, the whole world has gone after him. And there was already a plot to kill him, and a plot to kill Lazarus as well because of the miracle that Jesus had done for him. And so it says that Jesus entered the city and he went to the temple, but alas, it was late in the day. And so he returned to Bethany, to Lazarus' home with Martha and Mary, and he stayed there. Amen. There was a picture put out for y'all this morning. Picture of the centurion. I'd asked several there to pay close attention that there was going to be a test about what it is they were looking at. And so right coming in the main doors of the sanctuary, this picture was right next to this little podium with a cup, full cup of fruit of the vine on it and some unleavened bread. And a few of the ones that knew there was going to be a test, and I asked you to study it extra carefully. What's the connection between those two things? Between that, not the theological piece or any of that, between this picture particular and this representation of the Lord's Supper, which is his blood for the new covenant, his body given for us. Did anybody connect those dots? It was profound to me when I saw it. This goes with that, the blood coming from the cross. That's the spilling of Christ's blood. That's the point of this meal. And in this particular drawing, that became more than that. If he was able to look, you don't see a lot, but if you look at that man's hand and his arm, there's blood on it. He's got the blood of Christ on him. The meal that he just shared with his disciples, the cup, all of those things there just shared the day before, the night before, and here now. It's done. It's finished. That centurion that's been watching everything comes close, and he can't reach him. He's just reaching up there. But he has blood on his arm. May we, do you have blood of Christ on you? Has it been sprinkled on your heart? I hope so. So there's many, many things that happen in this final week. This chronologically ordered Bible has 12 pages between the time when Christ enters the city to the end of the crucifixion. 12 different discourses on teachings of what is going to happen at the end. All of John's recordings there of chapter 14 through or 15 through 17, those prayers he prayed were this week, were given during this week, those final prayers for us. So there's a lot happened this week. But I want to pick it up, and I want to end with us here with kind of from the perspective of this man. That a centurion, he was, the name literally transfers to leader of hundreds, and a centurion would have charge of anywhere from 60 to 100 men, depending on the need and the size of what was going on. And about 8 or 10 of those centurions, with their 800 or 1,000 men, would make up a cohort. And if you read through here, you see the different cohorts, different private armies. Different armies would go with different people. There was a cohort that was assigned just to the armory there in Jerusalem that protected the place where they stored their weapons and all of that. There was a cohort, 800 to 1,000 men assigned to that. There was a cohort that Pilate had. There was one that Herod had, as a matter of fact. And the players that we're going to see here are the ones that came with Pilate down from Caesarea, where the Rome had their secular headquarters, I guess, over the region. It was his army, his people. His was probably something I found out was those cohorts, even the legions where they had 1,000. 100 times as many as the cohorts had, as the hundreds and thousands. That they weren't all just Roman soldiers. A lot of them were conscripts or soldiers of fortune. They were not Roman. They were not Italian. They'd either been conquered by their army. As Rome would have it, they would come in and give peace if people would just worship the emperor and yield to Rome. And if that was the fact, then it'd be very much like a situation it was here in Israel at that time and in Jerusalem. They could rule, they could have their religion, they could do these different things as long as they didn't make too many waves. And a lot of the soldiers that came with them, one author said that Pilate's men that protected him, his cohort was made up mostly of Samaritan warriors from Samaria, north of Jerusalem, and we know the whole friction between Samaria and the south part. That they came to protect Pilate in this land of a bunch of Jews. They didn't think too much of the Jews, of course, we know that, but there would be a handful of leaders among them. It would be of Roman blood, Roman lineage, all of the centurions, for sure, all of the captains of hundreds, and the rest would be volunteers, as you would, mercenaries, come to fight with them. That was a new thought to me. And again, I want to read through the narrative here, maybe not every word, but enough for us to get the gist that this centurion, by the time that this picture was snapped if you will. There'd been a lot of things come before that. And I want to try and give us a picture of some of those things and have them come from his perspective. Have them see if we can't put ourselves into his eyes, particularly for all of the things that happened with the crucifixion itself. But this man had come down with Pilate. He stayed at the Praetorium. That's where the visiting cohorts or whatever, as the governor would come down, they would barrack in the Praetorium, and of course that's where they took Jesus in to beat him. And so it was Pilate's men. It was those that came into the country just to protect him that did the beatings and those things that we hear of. And it was a centurion from that cohort is what this man is. He wasn't stationed in Jerusalem. He wasn't one of the locals, so to speak. He came in maybe pretty fresh and observed all of those things that led him to make the confession that he does. Oh my. Jesus has his trials, goes before the Sanhedrin, goes before all of those things. Before Pilate, and I will pick it up right close to that. Again, probably not every word, but enough for us to get the gist. Everyone is before Pilate. The Jews have come and delivered him to Pilate and says, you've got to do something with this guy. He's broken our laws. And Pilate's got custody of him. And the Jews are, well, this is where the story picks up, is the crowd out in the courtyard there before Pilate's judgment seat, packed full with passionate people, with angry people, actually. And what shall I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ? Pilate asked, and they answered, crucify him. Why that crime? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. And wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. And for the third time he spoke to them. Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him. But with loud shouts and insistent demands, they continue to prevail upon him to crucify this man. And so the story goes, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Then the governor's soldiers, the ones that came down with him, with Pilate, took Jesus in the Praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. And they stripped him, and they put a scarlet robe upon him, and they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it upon his head. And they put a shaft in his right hand and knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. And they spit on him, and they took the staff, and they struck him with it on his head again and again. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, look, I am bringing him out to you and let you see, let you know what I've done to him and that I've found no basis to charge him with anything. And when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, here's the man. And as soon as the chief priests in the crowd, leading the crowd, and their officials saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him. As far as I am concerned, I find no basis to charge anything against him. This little manipulation politics come into it here in a little bit. And the Jews insisted, we have a law, and according to the law, he must die because he is claimed to be the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside of the palace. You see, if things got out of hand and the people you were governing, that didn't go good with the folks in Rome. They figured you didn't have a good handle on those things, and you could kind of get transferred to Siberia or someplace like that. And so he took Pilate took Jesus back in. He says, where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave no answer. He says, do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said, don't you realize that I have the power either to free you or to crucify you? And this is the first line I see the centurion being witness to as he stayed close to Pilate on that day. And Jesus told Pilate, he says, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from God. and therefore the one who handed me over to you is more guilty, and he's guilty of a greater sin than you are, Pilate. And I can imagine that centurion, not saying a word, listening there, staying close with a few soldiers protecting the governor. After what had already been done to Jesus, and more was to be done to him at their hands. Refusing to speak and make a case for him, and saying to this representative of Rome that says, don't you know I can either give you life or I could give you death? And Jesus looking at him saying, you have no power but what God's already given you. For that centurion who knew how authority works, who knew all of those things, like the other one that had a servant healed, told the governor, Rome's representative, you don't have any power except what God has given you. And I don't understand why the next statement was made. I didn't have a chance to search that out. But he says, therefore, Pilate, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. I don't know why that was said, but I just see that as the ones who handed him over had betrayed him. That was an act of betrayal and unbelief and sin for sure. And Pilate was just doing his duty, though. Pilate, you don't have any authority but what is given you. I've been placed in your hands. It's fallen in your lap, man. But understand, Pilate, that the one that turned me over to you has a greater sin than you do. You're just doing your duty, man. You're just doing your duty. But those who betrayed and those who turned me over, and those shouting, crucify out in the courtyard, theirs would be the greatest. And so from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free even more, but the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who claims to be a king of the Jews, is opposed to Caesar. There's the politics. And when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down in his judgment seat and placed a place known as the stone pavement where court was held and judgments were proclaimed. And it says it was about noon on the day of preparation for the Passover week. And he said to those gathered there, he says, here's your king then. But they shouted, take him away, and crucify him. And he said, shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. He says, we have no king but Caesar. Those Jews, we have no king but Caesar. And when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and he washed his hands in front of the crowd. And he says, I am innocent of this man's blood. And he said, it is your responsibility. And all the people answered, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. And so Pilate decided to grant their demand. And he released a man whom had been thrown into prison for the insurrection and for murder, the one they had asked for to be released, and he surrendered Jesus to their will. And when they had mocked him, he took him back in. They took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes, and then they led him out to crucify him, carrying his cross. He went out before them. And, of course, he'd already been scourged. He'd already been beaten. All of those things have happened. And it's this centurion that's carrying out the order. It's this guy that saw the crowd, how they were acting, saw the fact that his commander did not find guilt in him, saw how his commander nevertheless yielded to the politics of the situation and gave the people what they wanted. He's the one leading him out at this time. So all of these things, particularly these things, at the start of this journey, all the way past this picture to when Jesus is taken off of that cross, he was a witness to those things. I see him as to tell this story, and for the confession he made, I'm taking a leap and saying, I don't think this centurion lived a life that was unchanged by what he witnessed at the crucifixion of Christ. I believe when he uttered those words and stood at the foot of that cross, and undoubtedly, just because blood splatters, probably had blood on him as did the soldiers that drove the nails in. I don't think his spiritual life, his spiritual formation ended then. So I see him telling this story. I don't know how else they could have found out of what Pilate said to him as he was being questioned by him there, except someone in that room witnessed it and told about it. The beating and the scourging and the crown of thorns and the thing said to him there was no Jews in there to witness that, you understand. Someone had to come out of that group and say, this is what happened to him while we had him in the room. I'm taking a leap and just saying it's this guy. So he granted their command, and he sent them out. They led him out of the praetorium of the place in the in their armory, their temple that Pilate housed in and held court in. And they let him out, and he was carrying his own cross. He was carrying the crossbeam of that cross. And as the story goes, say the centurion could be telling it. As the story goes, he was falling and stumbling over and over again. And I could see that he wasn't going to make it. And so I saw a man in the crowd. Man, it looked like some kind of country bumpkin just come in from the fields, and he had his sons with him. It says the son's name was Alexander and Rufus. One was about 12, and the other one was younger. But they had a lamb with them. Some of you have heard the song, realize where this part of the story comes from. A perfect little lamb. Never seen a lamb so perfect. And we grabbed Simon the father, and he says, here, you come, you carry this cross. And of course, he had no choice but to do it. And the last thing he looked and said to his children before he picked that up and walked away from them was, children, watch the lamb. Watch that lamb. Betty, remember the song? Yeah. And Simon picked up the cross, and he carried it. And they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. We Romans call it by what it is, Golgotha. These locals, they've nicknamed it something else. And he says even there, said a large number of people followed him, even to that point, including women who mourned and wailed for him. And Jesus turned to them, and he said, daughters of Jerusalem, this is the same picture that he wept over the city coming into it from the Mount of Olives. The same thing is in his mind. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, blessed are the barren women and the women who have borne no babies and have never nursed a baby. And then Jesus says, to fulfill what Hosea the prophet said, then those people at that time, those women at that time will say, may the mountains fall upon us and crush us, and may the hills cover us over. May we just be taken, and may we just be dead. I read a story about the siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had a wall around it, of course. They had to build siege ramps around that, most likely of dirt, come and just start piling dirt up. Big hill. I saw the siege ramp they made at Masada. That was several 1,000 feet long as they started at the bottom, and the years they took to lay that siege ramp all the way up to the wall of Masada, where they could climb over the wall, breach the wall, and of course go in, and their desire was to kill everyone in there. And tradition has it that they committed suicide, the Jews that were in there before then, with the final holdout against the fall of Jerusalem. Other people there say they didn't because suicide was against Jewish law. So siege ramps, and they would build siege ramps against Jerusalem. And all the years they was doing that, nothing could go in, nothing could come out of the city. All they had to eat was what they had with them in the city. And it says of those times there that one mother named she was the daughter of Alexandria. I can't recall her name. People were starving to death, and the Romans would come and take whatever food they wanted, whatever was left there, and they would steal it from them, and the Romans came to do that. Down her street, as they walked past her street, they smelled something cooking, and they knew she had something to eat. They knew she had food in there, and they went in and demanded it, and she tried to say, no, I don't, but they could smell it. And they found out, they followed their noses. And they came to the pot, and it was the pot that she had boiled her infant in. And she'd consumed half of him already. And it says that the soldiers were aghast at that. And I believe they killed her and went on. I don't know what they did with the rest of the infant. Cannibalism has happened a whole lot when people are down to nothing. And that's what the siege of Jerusalem was. That's why it brought tears to Jesus' eyes. That's why he looked at those women mourning for him there and saying, ladies, don't cry for me. This is what's coming. 70 years later, Jerusalem lay in ruins. 70 years later, Rome besieged that city, tore it apart. No stone left upon anything. Hard times. Hard times. This God's story gets lived out. Just a few things remain here. Yeah. Jesus is crucified, says the heading to this particular part. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with us as we led the procession. Again, the centurion's talking. These men they knew who Barabbas was, and he'd gotten released, but these guys didn't. And so when we came to the place called the Skull, and there we crucified them. We crucified Christ along with the criminals. The criminals, one on his right, the other upon his left. And while we were doing that, the nails had gone in. He'd been stripped naked. Anyway, you remember some of the pictures that came out of Abu Ghraib when some of our soldiers got out of hand and they decided to have fun with those men that they had in prison there, those Iraqi men, and they stripped them naked and made them crawl on top of each other and took pictures posing next to them. That's the picture of when they stripped Jesus naked, that kind of a thing. As much disrespect as they could rain upon him. And during that, after that, I perceive it as after that cross is raised up and dropped in its stead and fastened there, the centurion, with his own ears, heard him say, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Centurion, you understand, as a leader of hundreds, he looked at everything tactically. He was always looking to see what's going on, what could happen here. Could this crowd get out of hand? Is there threats hidden here? Romans weren't particularly liked. Barabbas had been thrown in prison because of he killed a Roman or killed a soldier. Tactically, he's looking, what's going to happen and what will I need to do next if this happens? That's how a leader's mind, particularly a warrior's mind, thinks all the time. Where am I going to deploy my men? What do we need to do? And so as he witnessed all these things, that part of himself didn't leave himself. What does this mean? What's going on here? It happened up here. This is how it went down with Pilate. These things happened as we walked to the cross. I've stood here and this man says, forgive us. Ask his God to forgive us for what we've done to him, that we don't know what we're doing. This man is trying to put things together. And I think by the time this picture gets snapped, they were put together pretty well. Again, in the centurion's, from his perspective and in his voice, it says, after we crucified Jesus, we put signs above him that we'd carried down with us. Pilate had written one in 3 different languages so everybody could read it, and it says, Jesus, King of the Jews. It says when the Pharisees saw Pilate, what he'd done, they says, man, don't do that. That's what he claims to be. You're just putting fuel to the fire. And Pilate says, I've written what I've written. And that was the last thing we hear Pilate say before he dismissed them. And so we carried those signs with us and we nailed them to that cross, to the top of the cross, that all who would pass by would see them. And then my men, as the custom goes, we were soldiers. As the custom goes, my soldiers, the ones that had come down from Caesarea with me to guard the governor, they took his clothes and they divided it among themselves, and they would cast lots for it, and they would see who could win it. And there was one garment there that was a seamless thing. His undergarment was seamless from top to bottom, woven as one garment. And I saw how they didn't tear that one apart. They left it in one piece, so who could ever get it got the whole thing. I didn't like what they were doing, but sometimes you let your men do what needs to be done. And even that, the narrative goes, it was fulfilling Scripture, that they divided his garments among them and they cast lots for his clothes. Now the centurion was there, and it says the crowd, all who passed by, hurled insults at him. All those people that came out, it was not just his followers. I think a lot of people ended up there, and those who passed by, whether on the road or maybe they did this circuit like we go past a casket in our custom, and were able to say to him what they wanted to say. But it says that all those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads, saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple in 3 days." He just said that. Save yourself. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God. We talked a little bit in men's breakfast yesterday morning that our unbelieving world has Christ on judgment, or they have God on the judgment seat. They sit in judgment against God. God, if you're all powerful, why don't you do this? God, why did this happen to me? If you're a loving God, why would this go on in my life? Not a whole lot different than if you're such a big deal, come down off the cross if you've got the power. Not such a big deal at all to say that. And in the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law who had accompanied them mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in his God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And the soldiers also came up and mocked him. I saw them, I heard all of them do that. They offered him wine and vinegar, which we kept there. If you are king of the Jews, they said, save yourself. They picked up on what the Jews were saying. They had figured it out. It was a circus. It was the worst crucifixion I've ever had to preside over. The two criminals, they joined in the mocking earlier. Neither one held back. But as I stood there near enough to touch them, one of them raised his cuss words as loud as he could. He couldn't say them loud, but he raised them, and the other one said, he raised them, and even that criminal said, are you the Christ? Save yourself and save us. And he didn't say it in a nice way. He said, but that other criminal who moments before had mocked him, but now something different was about him. He looked over and said it to his companion. He said, don't you fear God? He said, since we are under the same sentence and we'll be as dead as he will in just a few minutes, we are punished justly, for we're getting what we deserve, what our deeds bore for us. This man has done nothing wrong. That was that thief's confession. And it says that he said to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I heard him say that. I was amazed that he would say that. And then this man in the center looked at him, and he told him, says, friend, I tell you the truth. Today you'll be with me in paradise. A Christian, a Jewish militant, a whole life lived as a thief and a robber. And this man who Pilate could find no fault in him, who his own people hated him, said, today you'll be with me in paradise. Wow, just all that bad life away, and you go in the same place I am. It amazed me. I also witnessed near the cross, some of the ladies had gathered. His mother was there. His mother's sister was there. It's been months since that's happened. It's taken me this long to come and tell you the story. And I remember you, Mary, Mother of Jesus. I remember what you said and what it was like for you as we let him down off the cross. And some of you other people, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, I've heard these others talk about you, but I meet you for the first time here as I tell you what I saw and what it did to me. As I tell you that I can't get these thoughts out of my head. And I saw them there when Jesus saw his mother, and there was one of his followers standing next to her, and he gave this man charge over his mother, and he told his mother, this man will be your son now, he will take care of you. And I see you standing there, John. He must have thought a lot of you, and he admired you, and so do I for that. And then the part that bothers me the most. Me, then, more than any other, as the one in charge of the men, as the one lucky enough to be their captain, my men that crucified him. I, more than any other, was his executioner. I, more than any other, could have turned, not done my duty, followed what my heart was telling me, what Pilate's heart was telling him, but it was about the 6th hour now, and I'd noticed from about noon all the way up to 3 o'clock on this day, the skies just got darker and darker and continued all the way up until almost sunset, the 9th hour. Darkness was over everything. And I heard this man say, almost at the end of the day, he spoke, Eloi, Eloi, sabachthani. I didn't know what it meant, John, and I looked at you, and you told me. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the part that hurts the most, you see. This man who, I knew he was devout. He's a Jew. He was a rabbi. He was one of their teachers. He knew what he was about. A week ago, people welcomed him into the city. They were throwing their coats down on the ground, letting his donkey ride across them. They were shouting their praise and their thanks. This was a good man. And I witnessed this good man coming to a place at the very end of his life, at the very moments of death, cry out to his God, my God, why have you forsaken me? His God had deserted him. I'd witnessed men do this before, witnessed men at the point of their death or the point of a loved one's death scream out, God, why did you do this? Why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? But for this man to do that, I'll never forget those words. Some thought he was crying out to Elijah and he was hallucinating. But later I heard him say, and again, John just nodded his head like he knew that this was supposed to happen. I heard him say, I am thirsty. And so one of the men ran to that soggy sponge, bad wine, and it was a bitter thing. And they filled the sponge and they held it up to him on a stick so that he could wet his lips. And it says that after that, right after that moment, I guess knowing it was the end, he said, Father, he's praying to this God that had deserted him just moments ago. He says, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And I saw him in that moment. His head hung and he was dead. He gave up his spirit. He gave up his spirit. I don't understand. And why would he still pray to his Father and say, God, here's my spirit. It's coming to you. I'm giving it up. And why would he say that to this God who had abandoned him and put him in a position like this to suffer so greatly? And at that moment, I'm told that your temple, the curtain in it was torn from top to bottom then, and I felt this myself, the earthquake that happened while it was still dark. Everything was shook that could be shaken, in my opinion. It says tombs broke open. Other of my soldiers said tombs broke open. Man, they've dead people, zombies, if you will, are coming out of their tombs. I couldn't believe that. I don't know anything about that. But I do know what I witnessed and what I saw. I do know as I stood at that cross, full of questions and full of I didn't understand. But I knew welling up in my heart, I said that this man was innocent, and I also said that this man surely must have been the Son of God. Surely, because of the people that followed him, because of the hatred even expressed towards him by his own people, his innocence, his willingness. He never fought once, carrying his cross, putting him on the crossbeam, nailing him to it, never fought once. Yes, his Father would forgive us. I don't understand, but surely this man was the Son of God, and to me that's when that picture was snapped. We often read the story without a lot of emotion sometimes, without a lot of awareness. It should be like one of our elite warriors, a ranger or a SEAL, witnessing those things, taking on that kind of a special duty. Crucifixion was reserved for Romans. There were no mercenaries here. There was just Roman citizens. That's what they did. They alone reserved the right of capital punishment. A man that experienced, a man that capable in war, hand-to-hand combat, killed many, no doubt, saw many killed, witnessed this man just, it's finished. God, I give to you my spirit. And it being over. And coming to a place where he looks and says, surely this was the Son of God. I believe that changed his life forever. I got to pondering, there's several centurions mentioned throughout the Gospels. There's the one that came to him, whether he was Roman or, again, one of the conscripts. Says that his servant was sick, and Jesus healed him with just a word. And that happened because that man knew how authority worked. And I even got to ruminating there that after this man rotated off of Pilate's detail and was, military transfers you all over, that he was the one that got transferred to, was it Capernaum? No, it was a man from Joppa that came. Where was the centurion that Peter was sent to? Cornelius. What town did he live in? Cornelius. Peter saw the vision, and he was sent there to that man's house, Cornelius, at where? Cappadocia? Maybe? Okay. I like to think anyway that it says that centurion there was a devout man, that he worshiped God, and his whole house worshiped God, his soldiers and his servants and his family, and that God showed him this vision, said, send for this man, he's going to come and tell you something. I don't know if that was the same guy, but my word, I believe that man's life was never the same. Never the same. Caesarea. Thank you. Yep. Good old Google comes through again. No, okay. Good job, DJ. It wasn't Google. Good job. So for us to see this picture, this is what happens Friday. I'll not see most of you again unless you come to the Breakfast Monday or show up at the community lunch on Friday at First Christian, Christ Congregational, rather. I'll not see you until Easter. I'll not see you to tell you anything about what happened on Good Friday and after that. So we stand at the beginning of a week that we started with praise. Their week started with praise. Those people there in that story, the disciples, the worshipers, the ones on the road, the Pharisees, Pilate himself, the soldiers that carried out the deed, all of their lives would change dramatically from that day when all these folks came in singing Hosanna and honoring this prophet and this rabbi in. All of their lives would change dramatically by the end of that week. And so when I ask you if you, like the centurion, have blood on you, if you have the blood of Christ on you, you understand what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the same thing as when I invite you to partake of the cup and the bread, partake of the symbol of the blood and the body. This week, if you were there, this week in the life you'll live from today until Good Friday, may you be changed. May the picture of this centurion, may perhaps as you read his story and read what happens during this week to Jesus, may you see things from his perspective.